For years, the sport horse world believed it understood breeding. Some years were strong, some years were weaker, but overall, the industry followed a predictable rhythm. Breeders planned their pairings carefully, foals were born each spring, young horses entered training, and eventually, a small percentage of those horses would rise to the top of international sport. That cycle had existed for generations. But then everything changed. During a time when the world was dealing with economic instability, inflation, rising costs, and growing criticism of equestrian sport, many people expected horse breeding to slow down dramatically. The COVID pandemic disrupted nearly every major industry in the world. And at first, many assumed the horse industry would suffer the same fate. Instead, the exact opposite happened. According to new data released by the World Breeding Federation for Sport Horses, also known as the WBFSH, foal registration surged after the pandemic and reached levels that surprised much of the industry. The numbers reveal something much bigger than breeding alone. They reveal where the dressage world may be heading, how modern sport horses are changing, and why many people inside the industry are beginning to worry about the future. Before the pandemic, foal numbers were relatively stable. In both 2019 and 2020, WBFSH stud books registered around 100,000 foals annually. That already represented an enormous breeding industry spread across Europe and beyond. But then came 2021. Foal registrations suddenly climbed to more than 108,000. Then, in 2022, registrations rose even higher to over 114,000 foals, creating the largest peak in the entire reporting period. This was not small growth. It was a breeding boom. And honestly, the timing made almost no sense. The global economy was struggling. Feed prices were rising rapidly. Veterinary care was becoming dramatically more expensive. Fuel costs increased. Inflation affected nearly every aspect of horse ownership. At the exact same time, dressage itself was facing some of the harshest criticism in modern history. Questions surrounding horse welfare became impossible to ignore. Rollkur debates intensified. Social media amplified controversial training videos. Public trust in elite equestrian sport began to weaken. Then, major scandals involving some of the biggest names in dressage pushed the sport even further into controversy. Many people assumed breeders would become cautious. Instead, breeders kept producing more horses. In some cases, they produced even more than before. So why? Because despite all the instability, demand for horses became incredibly strong during and after the pandemic years. People spent more time outdoors. Luxury hobbies remained surprisingly resilient. Wealthy buyers continued investing heavily in sport horses, and the young horse market became extremely profitable. At the same time, social media completely transformed the way horses were marketed. A young stallion no longer needed years of Grand Prix competition to become internationally famous. A single viral video showing extravagant movement could make a horse commercially valuable overnight. Movement became marketing, and nowhere was that more obvious than in modern dressage breeding. Today's dressage horses are often bred for spectacle. Breeders increasingly prioritize elasticity, suspension, uphill balance, and expressive front leg movement because those qualities attract attention at auctions, young horse championships, and online. The horses that go viral are usually the horses with the biggest movement, and over time, that changes breeding priorities. Bloodlines connected to stallions like Totilas, Vivaldi, Jazz, Johnson, Apache, Blue Hors Zack, and Quaterback became enormously influential because they consistently produced horses with expressive modern movement. For breeders, those bloodlines represented opportunity. A foal connected to a fashionable stallion could suddenly become extremely valuable. Elite foals began selling for massive prices at auction. Young stallions with flashy movement generated enormous attention online. Breeding became more global, more commercialized, and more visually driven than ever before. But what makes the WBFSH report especially interesting is what happened next. After peaking in 2022 at more than 114,000 foal registrations, the numbers began to fall again. By 2024, registrations had dropped back down to roughly 108,000 foals. Now, that still sounds like a massive number, and it is. The industry is still producing more foals than it was before the pandemic boom. But the decline matters because it may signal that reality is finally catching up with the market. The excitement surrounding young horses cannot continue forever. Breeding horses is expensive. Raising horses is expensive. Training horses is expensive. And eventually, even strong markets begin to cool down. By 2024, many breeders were facing enormous financial pressure. Feed prices had climbed dramatically in parts of Europe. Veterinary costs continued increasing. Energy prices remained unstable. Transportation became more expensive. And at the same time, the sport itself was facing growing public criticism over horse welfare. That combination may have forced some breeders to step back. And honestly, the drop in 2024 could represent something much bigger than a temporary slowdown. It may represent the beginning of a correction. Because throughout the pandemic boom, the horse market was driven heavily by emotion, hype, and fear of missing out. Buyers rushed to secure young horses connected to fashionable bloodlines. Breeders increased production while prices were strong. Auctions exploded with international attention. But eventually, every market reaches a point where people start asking difficult questions. Are there too many horses being produced? Can the market sustain these prices long term? And perhaps, most importantly, what happens to all the horses that do not become superstars? That is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for the industry. Because for every elite Grand Prix horse, thousands of horses quietly disappear from the spotlight. Some become wonderful amateur horses, but others struggle to find suitable homes, especially if they are difficult rides, physically fragile, or unable to meet the expectations placed on them. And that reality becomes harder to ignore when breeding numbers rise this quickly. At the same time, another conversation was growing quietly in the background. Many experienced horsemen began asking difficult questions about the modern dressage horse itself. Are modern dressage horses becoming too specialized? Are breeders prioritizing movement over durability? Can these horses remain sound long enough for Grand Prix careers? Those concerns matter because the modern dressage horse looks very different from the dressage horses of previous generations. Older dressage horses were often more compact, more grounded, and sometimes less extravagant movers. They may not have displayed the enormous suspension seen today's young horse classes, but many were incredibly durable and mentally resilient. Today's elite young horses often display breathtaking movement at very young ages. Their trot mechanics can appear almost unbelievable in slow-motion videos. But some critics believe the industry may be pushing breeding towards physical extremes, and that concern has become increasingly tied to the larger welfare debate surrounding modern dressage. Because breeding does not happen in isolation. Breeders respond to incentives. If judges reward extravagant movement, breeders will produce horses with extravagant movement. If auctions reward flashy trot mechanics, breeders will prioritize flashy trot mechanics. If young horse championships reward brilliance at 6 years old, breeding trends may begin to favor early maturity rather than long-term soundness. That does not mean breeders are intentionally harming horses. Most breeders genuinely care deeply about their animals and want to improve the sport. But economics shape decision-making, and modern sport horse breeding has become an incredibly expensive gamble. Think about what it actually costs to produce a top-level dressage prospect today. There are stud fees, veterinary monitoring costs, artificial insemination expenses, pregnancy care, foaling care, feed bills, farrier expenses, registration fees, insurance, and young horse training costs. And after all of that, there is still absolutely no guarantee the horse will succeed. For every Olympic horse, thousands never make it to the top. Some become amateur horses, some struggle physically, some never develop the talent people hope for, some simply do not possess the mentality required for elite sport. Breeding has always involved uncertainty, but modern breeding has become increasingly commercialized and financially risky. That pressure affects breeders emotionally as well as financially. Many smaller breeders are struggling to survive because costs continue rising every year. Hay prices have increased dramatically in many regions. Veterinary bills continue climbing. Labor is expensive. Land prices continue rising across Europe and North America. At the same time, larger breeding operations continue expanding, and some longtime horsemen worry the industry is becoming less personal and more corporate. Another fascinating detail in the WBFSH report involved geography. Europe still dominates sport horse breeding by a massive margin. Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, France, and Spain remain the primary centers of elite sport horse production. These countries possess generations of breeding infrastructure, highly organized stud books, auction systems, and strong competition pipelines. But one country stood out dramatically in the report: Brazil. According to the WBFSH data, Brazilian foal registrations more than doubled between 2019 and 2024. That level of growth suggests something important may be happening globally. The center of breeding influence may slowly be expanding beyond Europe. Modern reproductive technology has transformed international breeding. Frozen semen, embryo transfer, and advanced veterinary techniques now allow breeders across the world to access elite bloodlines that were once concentrated almost entirely in Europe. A breeder in South America can now use the same genetics as a breeder in Germany. A mare owner in Australia can access semen from internationally famous stallions within days. That globalization is reshaping the entire industry. At the same time, organizations like the WBFSH are increasingly emphasizing transparency, accountability, and welfare oversight. Their recent reports repeatedly focus on traceability systems and governance reforms, which reflects growing public pressure on equestrian sport. The horse world understands that people are watching more closely than ever before. Every controversial training clip can spread online within minutes. Every welfare debate becomes global conversation almost instantly. The sport can no longer operate quietly behind closed doors. That is one reason why systems like the Universal Equine Life Number, or UELN, are becoming increasingly important. These systems improve horse identification, breeding traceability, and long-term accountability throughout the industry. The equestrian world knows public trust is no longer guaranteed, and perhaps that is what makes this entire situation so fascinating. The breeding boom happened during the exact same period when dressage itself entered one of the biggest public image crises in its modern history. On one hand, criticism of the sport intensified dramatically. On the other hand, breeders continued investing heavily in the future. That contradiction reveals something important. Despite all the controversy, many people still deeply believe in dressage. They still believe in breeding exceptional horses. They still believe in the partnership between horse and rider. And they still believe the future of the sport is worth investing in. Because breeding has always been built on hope. Hope that the next foal might become extraordinary. Hope that generations of bloodlines and careful decisions might produce greatness. Hope that the next horse might carry the sport forward. But the next few years may determine what kind of future the industry creates. Will breeding shift towards soundness and longevity? Will rideability become more important again? Will welfare concerns reshape judging and breeding priorities? Or will commercial pressure continue pushing the industry toward increasingly extreme horses? Those questions are no longer theoretical. The foals being born today will define dressage for the next 15 years. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway from the WBFSH report. Foal numbers are not just statistics, they are a preview of the future of dressage itself.